Wow, what an audience here,
crowd,
huh, Steve?
Damon?
Look at this. You guys really packed the place.
It's awesome. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see everyone, and here we are again, a year later. Our crowds keep growing each year, and we're thankful for each one of you, and so we hope you enjoy today's program, and thanks to all our sponsors who make this all possible. So
the crowd keeps growing. I wonder if that is a fitting transition for looking at some of the numbers that we're going to share today about some of the amazing growth that we've seen here in Redmond. I've been living in Central Oregon for 15 years and looked at Redmond's specific employment and population numbers for many years as well, and it's been, I'll be honest, completely surprised when we were looking at some of the trends that we've seen here locally.
Yeah, I think you're going to be surprised as well, and pleasantly surprised at all the activity that's happening here in Redmond. It's great news, and it might tell the story of why the pressures of growth that we're feeling are real. So that's right.
The theme of our little talk, I think, this morning for you all is going to be this idea of this level of growth that we have seen. And it's not growth for growth's sake. I think that's really critical for us to sort of focus on. It's one thing to say, like, we're growing fast, but to what end? And when we're looking at some of the information we're going to look at today, the growth that we're seeing is based on the back of economic growth of businesses coming here and jobs being created. This is not people moving here simply because we have affordable housing or great quality of life. They're coming here for economic reasons, which is far more sustainable in the long run than for some of those other reasons that you see nowadays with quality of life movement and teleworkers, et cetera. But first, I sort of wanted to get Steve's perspective. Could you sort of give us some insight into the businesses that we're seeing move here, some of the success stories we've seen over the last year or so from an EDCO perspective?
Yeah, and I'll talk the numbers briefly here about what's happening here in Redmond. When we look back in our pending projects pipeline, we've got about 24 projects that represent over 2,700 jobs and over $829 million in capital investment. Well, those are big numbers, obviously. Not all those will happen, but to put that in perspective, this year we've got 7 projects that are in process in construction or will be coming out of the ground in the next few months. And the total of that is about 601,000 square feet and $200 million in capital investment. So that's what's closer when you look at those bigger numbers. If you drive around on the east side of Redmond, the industrial area, you're seeing some of those projects already coming out of the ground. Some very exciting ones with Wild Mike's that will be continuing their project here soon. Hopefully Nosler will have a project coming soon, and a few others that will be very exciting, larger projects that have been in the works for a while, some of them delayed because of the pandemic and the resulting interest rates and supply chain things. So we're working through that now and getting to the point where those projects are going to move forward.
Those two examples are both sort of manufacturing related. Is that sort of a trend that you see here? I mean, the data will sort of show us that there is a distinct manufacturing story going on, but in your experience in sort of recruitment and retention, has that sort of been the bread and butter for Ready?
It has, and what's interesting, especially over the last few years, we've had more grow projects than move projects. I think the economic uncertainty in the greater picture has slowed some of the companies that were thinking about moving, but the companies that are here are doing well. They're growing. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of those numbers, and they need room to expand. And so, 2 out of 3 are grow projects that we're working on now. So that's all great news, as long as we can continue to support them with the land and the buildings, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, are you ready for these, or do you have a few more?
No, that's good. Let's keep going.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
If you have more, let me know.
Yeah, I'll squeeze it in.
Okay. Let's just really quickly take a pause, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to do this in the middle of all the clinking of your beautiful sounds of forks and knives. We're going to interrupt you with some boring data, but I think it's important to see how off the charts Redmond has been compared to what we're seeing from a statewide perspective. I could have also put many communities up here and compared it to Redmond, and it would have looked just as impressive. But if we're just looking at the last year, so last year being third quarter of 2023 is the most recent data we have, but if we compare that to the third quarter of 2022, the employment growth for all industries in Redmond was nearly 3% in a single year, 3% employment growth. The state of Oregon saw employment basically flat, a drop of 0.2%. Sorry, that was our wage growth. Oregon saw just a growth of 1.1%. We're really, way above the growth rate in just the last year. If we focus on manufacturing specifically, the right-hand side here, 6.3% growth in a single year in manufacturing jobs. This is sort of that pipeline you're talking about of these growth companies that are really moving the needle here. I mean, they were a major percentage of the total Redmond all industry growth was specifically for manufacturing growth here in Redmond. And we look, how the difference between us here in Redmond and what we're seeing at the statewide level is really exaggerated when we're looking at manufacturing, where this is where manufacturing across the state has dropped almost 3% in the last year. So the rate of growth we're seeing is totally an anomaly from what we're seeing from a statewide perspective. Really impressive. But I think more impressive than just looking over the last year is let's get a longer view perspective and see what the trends look like here compared to before the pandemic began. So we're going to look back to third quarter of 2019. We kept the same scale for everyone's sake. There we go. Just had to go higher on my arm. So same scale. We're looking at similar information here. So all industries is on the left. You can see the wage growth in the job growth there. Nearly 30% growth in jobs in Redmond since 2019. 30% almost we've hit. Statewide, 1.3%. I mean, this is the rocket ship going off to space here. This is, for many years, I also covered our neighbors to the south, Bend, and we used to talk about the fast job growth we'd see down there and how they were one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Bend never saw growth rates that looked like this, ever, in the last 20 years. And really impressive, too, to see that it's not just jobs being added, but Steve, a lot to your point here about sort of the quality of the businesses that are growing and being recruited here. We also see massive growth in wages, 26.5% growth in wages. Over that period of time.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, the type of jobs that we focus on at Ready are these higher paying manufacturing type jobs. And we have that really strong industry base here with companies like BASX and Medline and FuelSafe. And those companies are growing and they're doing well. And that's where we're seeing these job numbers come from, these wages going up because of the type of folks that they are hiring, which is perfect for our community.
Yeah, and it's really important to note, the cost of living is an issue we might talk about a little bit here, but in order to account for the rapid growth in cost of living that we've seen across Central Oregon, seeing that these wage growth are exceeding inflation, exceeding the growth in cost of living is really encouraging. Really quick, just the same trend on the right there, you can see our manufacturing numbers here in Redmond are off the charts compared to what we're seeing statewide as well. We're actually statewide, we saw manufacturing drop 5% over the last 4.5 years or so. Okay, so that's Redmond specific, comparing us to the state, but you might say, yeah, we're always pretty special over here in Central Oregon. We're always a little bit different. But let's say, what does Redmond's growth look like compared to what we're seeing for the rest of Deschutes County, excluding Redmond? And this is that instance where I'm talking about is this is not sort of happening all across the region in the same way. Redmond is really blowing Bend out of the water in many ways, where the rest of Deschutes County over the last 4 or so years has seen about a 4% growth in jobs. Once again, compared to our nearly 30% here in Redmond. And you see the same story as far as manufacturing. Once again, these are not numbers you see every day. There's something special going on here, some real activity, some real energy that's happening locally. And
just to jump in there, one of the reasons that we can support that growth is because we have more land available here in Redmond. And Crook County and Jefferson County do have land available as well. Bend's a little tighter, but we've always been able to support the growth because we've had the place for folks to go. And it's more challenging today. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that is one of the reasons, or one of the factors, I should say, that has kept Redmond in a good position going forward.
And we'll talk about some headwinds and some tailwinds, the things that are pushing us forward here in Redmond, and the things that might be holding us back into the future. But for me, one of the biggest things that we need to pay attention to as a community, this is something that communities all across the nation are focusing on right now. This is a quote from me. The future of economic development over the next decade will be an intense battle for workers. That's got to be the focus. It's got to be a warm body issue. We have a major demographic conundrum where we have a huge wave of baby boomers retiring. This isn't news to most of you. And every generation that comes after those baby boomers, except for millennials, is smaller and smaller and smaller. And so if we want to continue to see our communities grow and thrive, we need workers, which means we need to recruit people in our communities who are working age population. And this is going to be sort of some of the focus that we have moving forward.
You know you've made it when you get to quote yourself on stage. Just saying.
It might be the first time I've done that, but I like it, all right?
So, and to support a positive thing, even though it does create challenges, is Redmond has seen growth of about 1,000 people a year over the last few years moving into the community. And those are folks who are being employed in Redmond as well. And so, to Damon's point, you need people to support an economy. Economic development depends on people, and national trends are going the wrong way when it comes to people. Redmond has been able to bring those folks in because of the lifestyle and people wanting to be here. So that's a positive. It causes some headwinds, which we'll talk about here in just a second.
Yeah, so let's start on the negative side. Let's talk about those headwinds, the things that we've got to battle through as we're looking into the next 5 or 10 years across Redmond and for all of us in Central Oregon more generally. The top one, and let's think of this a bit of a spectrum from left to right here, sort of the biggest headwinds to slowly getting to the biggest tailwinds. Affordability to me is one of the biggest issues that we face. Whether that's housing affordability, the cost of goods and services, it pinches a lot of people out of our communities. And when you pinch people out of the communities, that jeopardizes this quote, right, by me. So if we're trying to battle for these workers, we need to be able to have housing available for these folks to live in at a price point that is affordable for the wages that they make. So fortunately, Redmond has always had a more affordable landscape than, say, Bend or other communities in Central Oregon. But we're increasingly losing that label. It is not affordable in Redmond any longer, and so this is a major headwind for us.
It is, and when you look back over the last few years, if you look at the numbers from December of 22 to December of 23, the median housing price increased 20% to $510,000. And currently, it's at $537,000, so it's gone up another 6% or so. And I think, I've lived here a long time, as a number of you have, and you just think, oh, there's gonna be a cap on this. When you look at other communities, especially that are land constrained, it can go a lot higher. And look at Bend, where they're at. And so planning for that and trying to provide enough supply and trying to manage that is a real challenge and one of the headwinds that we face.
So demographics, we won't spend too much time on. That's sort of the problem statement that we're trying to address, is like, how do we make sure that we continue to have a pipeline of workers that are moving into our communities, that can afford to move in our communities? This is the demographics issue is a national problem that we're all facing. I feel actually pretty encouraged, assuming, taking the affordability, complexity, and issues out of there. I feel pretty encouraged by the level of growth that Steve had just talked about, the number of people that we're drawing into Redmond, whether that's stealing them from other parts of Central Oregon. That's okay, we can steal, there's nothing wrong with that. Or we're pulling them from other parts of the state or the nation. We're doing okay here, but this is something we don't want to lose sight of, is this demographic issue that we're going to have to face. Our sort of share of young families in Redmond is quite a bit higher than we see in the average community across the state. So looking okay there.
And that was something I learned when when Damon was putting this presentation together, is we're getting families that are moving to Redmond. That's really encouraging. A lot of the folks that have come to Central Oregon are more the retirement age and not necessarily workforce. And so seeing those statistics is really encouraging.
Yeah, retirees are the worst. No, I'm kidding. I'm just joking. That's a joke. It's okay. Don't tell the governor. Okay, so infrastructure. This is one that we at Business Oregon focus a lot on. Infrastructure is a major component of the statewide funding we have in economic development. And we see across the state today massive, massive infrastructure issues. Communities are seeing water systems, sewer systems, roads that are well past bridges, that are well past the point of what they were ever designed to be at. And these are major challenges of trying to bring back the old things up to current standards. What's interesting about Redmond is infrastructure is a headwind, but not because of us trying to maintain the old stuff, but trying to keep up with this growth. How do we create the new stuff that needs to come in? And I don't know if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, and if you look at the public side of things, there's over $500 million in public projects that are coming out of the ground in the next couple of years, and the airport and wetlands complex for wastewater, some of these things that some of you are aware of. But I really have to give the folks at the city credit for their foresight and their vision to tackle this issue. It's not easy, but they're one of the challenges is transportation and getting people in and out of Redmond, and they are working on creating sort of an east side bypass that hopefully will connect with 97 around McVeigh Avenue area to where we can get folks in and out of the airport, the fairgrounds, the industrial areas much faster. They're extending 9th Street through the old golf course down to Airport Way. That's a project that's already in design and moving forward. So they're focusing on these and being really intentional and understanding. And so just to give the folks at the city their credit for their vision on that.
Yeah, and if we're going to talk about crumbling pains or growing pains, we'd much rather take the growing pains that we're having to address from an infrastructure standpoint than having to address some of the issues of a crumbling infrastructure system that we're seeing. Housing production, we've already talked about housing a little bit and affordability. What's really encouraging, so we're sort of sliding into some of the things that are more tailwind, some of the positive things that are pushing us forward a little bit. Housing production looks pretty good here. We've actually seen our developers doing a lot of work in Redmond, focusing on it. We see a lot of houses and multifamily units coming on the market, which is really encouraging as we move forward, especially that multifamily side, because that helps keep some of the affordability in check. And then, at the end of the day, economic development, I think oftentimes, we think of economic development as business recruitment, retention. What's the third one? Recruitment, retention.
Expansion.
Expansion, thank you. That was a test for Steve, he passed.
Barely.
I'm an economist for an economic development agency, I didn't even know what the third one was. But we often think of that as sort of what economic development is. But economic development is a coin that on the other side of that is workforce development and workforce issues. And those are really two sides, the business recruitment, business stuff, and the workforce are two sides of the same coin that together make up economic development. And for us, as I said, our competitive advantage has been we address the warm body issue because people want to be here. They want to live here. We have amazing quality of life. Redmond specifically has amazing quality of life. You have the best views in Central Oregon, by the way, especially the airport. I don't know how they got those views, but we're kind of like, could we move the airport somewhere else to just steal that great prime real estate? I didn't say that. That's okay.
No,
it's good where it's at.
Zach's out there somewhere. Yeah, probably you don't want to see him.
I didn't say that, Zach. Quality of life is just a major component that I think is going to continue to push us forward going forward, and especially helping address some of the demographic challenges that we're seeing today. And then finally, the last big tailwind is the job thing. It's this momentum that we have. It's really hard to build momentum for economic growth in building, seeing growth in companies to the extent that we're seeing them right now. The types of companies that have been recruited to Redmond specifically, as well as some of our ability to sort of meet the need of those employers it's like this rolling stone that can't grow any moss. And keeping this momentum is hard, but it's really, really hard to build any momentum in the first place. And so I'm really encouraged that our ball is rolling down the hill right now, and we definitely don't have any moss on it.
No, it's very positive. So we're going to have to wrap up here, but just one last comment, one last stat I wanted to throw out there on the housing production is Redmond is set to have 400 to 450 new housing units coming on over the next 2 to 3 years to help address the the growth that we're seeing. So another area where the city's been very proactive, and Hayden Homes has been very instrumental. I know those folks are here somewhere. So thank you all for the work that you do on the housing side, because we got to have places for our workers to live. So
awesome. Thank you so much, Steve, for having us, for having me. This is such a pleasure to be here. Ready is an amazing organization. EDCO's an amazing organization. Do what you can to support them. Continue to do the good work you guys are doing here in Redmond. It's really encouraging to see from a statewide perspective. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Damon.